IHMS.
If the flag flying over your local city hall wasn't a symbol of your home, but like a daily, unavoidable reminder that your ancestors were conquered.
Yeah, that's a really heavy thought.
Right. But for millions of people, that isn't just a metaphor. I mean, it's their everyday reality.
It literally is.
So today, we're looking at a blueprint meant to fix exactly that. The Ethiopian National Dialogue, a framework for minority rights. Welcome to the deep dive. We are really glad to have you with us in the room as we explore what is honestly a truly massive piece of political architecture.
And it is just a fascinating, highly complex blueprint. So today's mission is to explore how a nation made up of, over 80 distinct ethnic groups is attempting to rewrite its fundamental social contract.
Which is no small task.
Not at all. We are analyzing a memorandum dated July 6th, 2026. It was submitted to the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission by Professor Abdi Khalil, who is acting on behalf of minorities in Ethiopia. And this document lays out 8 structural pillars. They're designed to protect minority rights and achieve what the authors call historical justice.
But before we dive into how you even begin to untangle a political knot with 80 different threads, there is something we need to make crystal clear to you right up front.
Yes, very important.
The sources we're dissecting today contain intensely politically charged claims.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, regarding history, religion, governance in Ethiopia. It's all very sensitive.
That is a crucial baseline for our discussion today. We must clarify that we are not taking sides here.
Exactly.
Nor are we endorsing any of these specific viewpoints. Our job here is strict impartiality. We're simply examining the ideas, the demands, and, the historical grievances exactly as they're laid out in this original memorandum.
Yeah, we just want to understand the logic and the mechanics behind the proposals they've actually presented. So let's start with the foundation of this proposal. The document argues that before a nation can agree on its future, it has to, agree on its past.
Right, which is often the hardest part.
Oh, for sure. And the very first pillar of this framework goes straight for the jugular of the Ethiopian state's foundational mythos. It tackles state building and nation building.
Yeah, it demands a complete deconstruction of what the authors term mono-ethnic narrative.
Mono-ethnic narratives, right.
To build true unity, the memo argues, the country has to actively confront its history of conquest rather than glorifying it. Specifically, the text points to the late 19th century expansions by Emperor Menelik II.
Okay, let's unpack this.
It explicitly names the annexations of Harar, Kaffa, Wolamo, and the Ogaden regions.
Wait, so they are essentially asking a nation of over 120 million people to completely abandon its mainstream historical story just to accommodate the grievances of minority groups.
Yes, essentially.
I mean, how does a government even begin to sell that to the majority population? It's like trying to bake a national cake where few people insist their flavor is the only one that matters, while other people's historical ingredients were actively thrown in the trash by force.
That is a great way to put it. And what's fascinating here is that friction, that immense friction at the heart of this document. The authors argue that those late 19th century conquests led to mass displacement.
Right.
And the suppression of entire civilizations. So to the minority groups represented here, these are historical realities that simply cannot be buried under nationalist mythologies.
Because burying it just continues the harm.
Exactly. It directly fuels ongoing cultural erasure today. If the state's origin story relies on ignoring your conquest, you are basically constantly being told you don't truly belong.
So how does this abstract historical deconstruction look in everyday practice, like administratively?
Well, it starts with the most fundamental tool of culture, which is language.
Sure.
The proposal demands a highly inclusive national language policy. Instead of one dominant tongue dictating all of government and law, it argues for elevating more widely spoken languages to national working languages.
Right, and enforcing multilingual public services across the board, which, that used to be incredibly expensive and difficult to do.
It did. But the memo points out that we don't live in the 1900s anymore. They make a very pragmatic modern point. In the digital era, offering government services in multiple languages isn't some logistical nightmare. It's entirely feasible.
Yeah, you just need good software and translation infrastructure.
Exactly. And more importantly, it is essential for citizens to actually feel a sense of national belonging when they interact with their own government.
That makes total administrative sense. But then the memo shifts from administration to pure emotion. It spends a lot of time talking about the national flag.
Yeah, because national symbols act as deeply emotional markers of existence, or in this case, erasure. A flag is never just a piece of cloth.
No, never.
The memo demands a flag that equally represents every Ethiopian, because for many Muslims and the Harari people, the historical symbols of the country evoke really deep trauma.
And the document gives a hyper-specific example that really brings this to life. It references the loss of Harari independence in 1887, and then it points to an incident at the Jami Mosque in the 1920s. According to the text, authorities confiscated a flag there simply because they claimed it challenged a Christian flag.
Which explains their very specific demand regarding the flag today.
Yeah.
The minorities represented in this memo explicitly want to keep the current modernized national flag. They are fiercely pushing back against any movement to revert to an older, plain flag.
Because they associate that older flag solely with Orthodox Christianity or the historical monarchies that subjugated them.
Exactly. They want a symbol that represents their present inclusion, not their historical defeat.
So if history and symbols are the root of the trauma, how do you build a physical government that ensures that trauma isn't repeated? You have to change the math of how laws are made.
Right. You need a new structural blueprint.
Which transitions us from confronting history to the actual architecture of government. The second and third items.
The authors believe the federal structure is still Ethiopia's most viable model, but they argue it desperately needs structural democratization.
Structural democratization.
Yeah, they want to build literal legal walls to insulate minority regions from numerical power politics.
And their proposed method for doing this is pretty intense. They were proposing a collective veto power for minority regions over federal legislation that impacts their identity and rights.
It's a massive shift in governance. They modeled this directly on the European Council's veto mechanisms.
Okay, right.
Think about how the European Union operates. Smaller nations have specific mechanisms to ensure they aren't completely dictated to by massive economies like Germany or France.
Yeah, so they don't just get steamrolled.
Exactly. This memo wants that same structural protection for ethnic minorities in Ethiopia.
So what does this all mean? I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. If you give a collective veto to minority groups over federal legislation, doesn't that risk total catastrophic governmental gridlock?
Well,
I mean, if every small group has their hand on the legislative emergency brake, the train just never moves forward.
if we connect this to the bigger picture, that gridlock isn't an accident. The authors of the memo are attempting to legally engineer a system where smaller populations have disproportionate structural power to protect their existence.
Wow, okay.
They look at the basic math of democracy, majority rules, and they realize that when the majority belongs to a completely different ethnic group, majority rules can become a death sentence for a minority culture.
Oh, wow.
So the gridlock is a feature, not a bug. It forces intense compromise because it physically prevents the majority from steamrolling the minority.
Framing gridlock as a survival mechanism makes a lot of sense. It shifts the perspective entirely.
Yeah, it really does.
And to enforce that veto mathematically, they want to completely restructure Ethiopia's upper house of parliament, the House of Federation.
Right. Currently, representation there is heavily influenced by population size. This proposal demands changing it so every ethnic group or state gets an equal vote, regardless of how many people live there.
They explicitly compare it to the U.S. Senate, where Wyoming has the exact same number of senators as California, despite having, a tiny fraction of the population.
Exactly that mechanism. Furthermore, they are advocating for the creation of brand new regional states based on historical claims.
Specifically, naming the people of Wallo and Welquay, right?
Yes. Plus, they want minority groups officially recognized under United Nations indigenous criteria. That isn't just a symbolic title, it carries specific international legal weight and protections.
And they aren't just focusing on rural or historical regions either. The document specifically loops in the major economic hubs, the federal cities like Addis Ababa and Dire Dawa.
Right, the urban centers.
Yeah, they are demanding inclusive urban governance that structurally guarantees the rights of minorities living in those metropolitan areas, along with proportional representation for communities living outside their traditional home regions.
But designing a legislative brake pedal is one thing. Dealing with the physical footprint of historical trauma is something else entirely.
Oh, completely.
And that brings us to what is arguably the most explosive part of this framework: religious affairs and reconciliation.
The fourth agenda item.
Yes, the blueprint of a government directly impacts deeply personal identities. The memo insists that any national dialogue has to honestly confront instances where military conquest resulted in the destruction of one faith's institutions, only to be replaced by another's.
And they name names and locations again here. The text explicitly cites the historical destruction of the Sheikh Bazik Mosque in Harar. And it does just say it was destroyed. It states that the Medhain Elam Orthodox Church was constructed right on top of its ruins.
Which brings an incredible level of tension to the dialogue. Beyond these massive historical disputes, they are also asking for day-to-day administrative neutrality.
Right.
The memo demands a prohibition on public offices scheduling mandatory sanitation campaigns, official town meetings, or national student exams on local religious holidays.
Which is totally fair.
Yeah, they want an end to government interference with Islamic institutions, arguing that if the Constitution says all religions are equal, well, the bureaucratic state has to actually respect all observances equally.
Now, I can easily see how scheduling a national math exam on a local religious holiday is a clear administrative failure. That's a blind spot you can fix with a new calendar and a pen stroke.
Right.
But how on earth does a modern government untangle a centuries-old property dispute where a church now physically sits on the site of a former mosque? That seems impossibly fraught.
It is incredibly complex.
Because to right a historical wrong, you almost have to commit a present-day wrong. If you tear down the church to rebuild the mosque, you're just reversing the trauma onto a new generation of worshipers.
Yes.
You aren't erasing the trauma, you're just moving it.
The aha moment here is realizing that true historical restitution in physical space might actually be impossible without creating new wounds. What the memo is asking for goes far beyond a formal apology or a Truth Commission report that just sits on a shelf gathering dust. They are demanding literal physical rectification of historical religious injustices.
Wow.
It is a demand to unwind history, which touches the deepest, most sensitive nerves of community identity, faith, and generational memory.
To handle exactly those types of impossible historical paradoxes, the memorandum argues that Ethiopia needs incredibly robust, entirely neutral frameworks.
Exactly. You can't just pass a law saying, be fair. You need the physical machinery to enforce it.
And that machinery is outlined in their push for institutional building and the rule of law. Item 5. The memo points out a massive gap. The Constitution might guarantee rights on paper, but there is no mechanism to protect them in reality. So they propose creating an independent minority protection institution.
Yes, an autonomous, well-funded body.
What would that actually look like in practice, though?
It would be dedicated solely to investigating violations against minorities and protecting their heritage. Think of it as a specialized civil rights division with serious investigative teeth.
Got it.
And alongside this, they demand linguistic access to justice.
Meaning state-funded interpreters in the courts. Because if you are put on trial, or if you're trying to sue someone for stealing your land and the judge and lawyers are speaking a language you don't fully understand, you don't actually have access to justice.
No, not at all.
You were just a spectator at your own trial.
Exactly. And they tie this lack of access to a need for affirmative action policies to reverse decades of systemic discrimination against indigenous groups.
Right.
Which connects directly to the economic pillars of the memo, item 6. They extensively address socioeconomic affairs, specifically the restitution of unlawfully confiscated property, lands, and ancestral assets.
They highlight Harari communities here again, right?
Yes, framing property restitution not just as a legal right, but as the absolute cornerstone of economic stability for minority groups.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They aren't just asking for a seat at the political table. They're asking for an entirely new justice system to oversee the table.
Yeah.
It's like finding out your family home was built on someone else's land, and the original owners don't just want a historical plaque acknowledging what happened, they want the title deed back.
But getting that title deed back requires navigating a massive obstacle, which they identify in item 7 as entrenched corruption. The memo explicitly calls for neutralizing deep state networks and promoting good governance.
Deep state is a heavily loaded term. How are they using it in this specific context?
They're using it to describe non-transparent administrative structures and entrenched political elites who retreat into authoritarianism whenever their power is threatened.
Oh.
Think of it as the invisible bureaucracy that can quietly kill any reform. The memo argues these networks actively undermine democratic progress and minority inclusion just to protect their own wealth and influence.
Which makes sense.
The authors are linking the ability to achieve economic justice directly to dismantling these unaccountable power structures. If the judicial and political systems remain rigged by a deep state, that historical land restitution we just talked about, it never happens. The paperwork just gets lost forever.
Right. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, Agenda Item 8, revealing the ultimate objective of every structural change, veto power, and institutional reform we've discussed today.
The most important part.
The ultimate goal of all of this is peace building and conflict resolution, or, stripped of the academic jargon, survival.
The memo highlights a really stark contrast that often gets missed in international headlines. When the world looks at Ethiopia, large-scale regional conflicts, specifically the text names tensions among massive groups like the Oromo, Amhara, and Tigray, tend to completely dominate the political landscape and the news cycle.
The macro conflicts, like the big wars for political dominance.
Right. But while those macro conflicts dominate the attention, smaller minority populations are facing something entirely different. They aren't fighting for regional dominance. They are facing the existential threat of total obliteration through assimilation, marginalization, and cultural erasure.
The violence they face is often quieter, but it is absolute.
Exactly.
It's fascinating that while the world watches the titans clash over political control, this document shifts the focus to the micro-level existential threats of minorities who are just trying to exist. Is the memo suggesting that solving these minority rights is actually the secret key to stopping the larger macro wars?
This raises an important question, and the memo answers it with a resounding yes. It argues that sustainable national peace cannot be achieved by merely mediating between the dominant factions.
So you can't just get the big players in a room, broker a ceasefire, and call it peace.
No. True, lasting peace requires addressing the structural vulnerabilities of all communities, no matter how small.
The document literally uses the phrase, federalism as a panacea. It concludes that a democratic federal system, if it is heavily reformed to include equal representation and those minority shareholder veto powers we talked about, is the only viable solution to Ethiopia's political crises.
That's their core argument.
The idea is that true peace means everyone becomes a winner through mutual understanding and structural protection, rather than playing a zero-sum game of demographic dominance.
And in their conclusion, they respectfully but firmly demand that all of these issues, the constitutional vetoes, the historical truths, the religious property disputes, be officially integrated into the national dialogue process. They want truth established, grievances addressed, and moral responsibility acknowledged on a national stage.
It is a sweeping, monumental framework. We've explored the massive structural pillars proposed by Professor Khalil and the minorities in Ethiopia today, from the demand to deconstruct national historical narratives and institute minority vetoes in the legislature, to the profoundly difficult paradox of righting religious property disputes.
All the way to neutralizing deep state corruption to ensure economic survival.
Exactly.
And while this specific memorandum is tailored to the Ethiopian national dialogue, the mechanics detailed here should resonate deeply with you wherever you live. This document is a masterclass in the challenges faced by any citizen of a diverse, multicultural society.
Oh, absolutely.
How do you balance majority rule with the absolute structural necessity of protecting marginalized voices from being erased?
It's the ultimate democratic tightrope, which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over after you step away from this deep dive. If a nation completely deconstructs its overarching shared narrative to validate every specific historical grievance and grants legislative vetoes to every minority group to protect them, well, what becomes the new glue that actually holds the country together?
Yeah. Does recognizing every difference ultimately unite a nation through justice or pull it apart through gridlock?
A profound paradox without an easy answer, but one absolutely worth asking. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of a nation's dialogue. We'll see you next time.
IHMS